Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Gibson. I'm Director Curator of Gallery 1CO3, which is the campus art gallery of the University of Winnipeg. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's conversation, Bringing to Light IRSS, Reconciliation, Indigenous Matriarchy, and Cultural Abundance. Today's event is presented in conjunction with Jaimie Isaac's exhibition, Brings to Light, at Gallery 1CO3, which addresses the legacy of residential schools and Indigenous knowledge and language repatriation. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered indeed on Treaty 1 territory, the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Innu, Anish-Innu, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis. I also want to give gratitude for our water, which is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. I want to take a moment to note that universities, art galleries, and museums are part of a larger colonial system that have actively participated in the dispossession of Indigenous cultures and have excluded the presence of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous voices, and Indigenous ways of knowing. Gallery 1CO3 is committed to taking steps to redress this situation by foregrounding Indigenous curators, artists, knowledge keepers, and their perspectives. And this is indeed an ongoing journey. For artist and curator Jaimie Isaac, it's important to expand conversations around art by engaging with community elders, with activists, with educators. She actually suggested that Gallery 1CO3 partner with the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba and the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation to engage speakers who have a wealth of knowledge. And for that, I am grateful. Today, we are honored that the Treaty Relations Commission and NCTR agreed to collaborate with us, and we are humbled to listen to the words of three remarkable speakers: Elder Marlene Gallagher, Educator Kaila Johnston, and Professor Aimée Craft. It is now my pleasure to introduce event moderator Angeline Nelson, Acting Lead of Indigenous Engagement, and Witchy-Wakanak's Director of Community Learning and Engagement. Angeline Nelson was raised in Roseau River First Nation. She is Anishinaabe and Cree with maternal roots in Tatasqueyak Cree Nation. She is the acting lead for Indigenous engagement, as I said, and she oversees, as I said, the Witchy-Wakanok Learning Center. She holds a Bachelor of Science from the University of Manitoba, which helped her to grow the STEAM outreach programming at Witchy-Wakanok for Indigenous youth. She's also deeply connected to Anishinaabe ways of being through the Medewin Lodge, powwow dancing, and ceremony. Part of her work is also focused on ensuring families have opportunities to stay connected to Indigenous culture through some of Witchy's long-time cultural programming. So thanks very much, Angeline.
Thanks, Jennifer, for the introduction. As my family has often reminded me, I just wanted to introduce myself first, also in my language. So, Bonjour, Nindwe Magneduk, Hasanis and Tijikas, Bishu, Indudem, Gwanishkazibing and Dunji, Nijo Made, Nishnaabe Koyendao. So, as Jennifer mentioned, my name is Angeline Nelson, but it's very important for me to introduce myself in my language just to kind of set the tone for today, state where I'm from and my connection to my family, my community. So welcome everybody to today's panel. Thank you, Jennifer, for the invitation to be here today to help moderate the panel. So today's panel, Bringing to Light Indian Residential School Survivors, Reconciliation, Indigenous Matriarchy, and Cultural Abundance. So as Jennifer noted, we have three incredible panelists for today's event, each of whom will share for about 15 to 20 minutes. Following their talks, we'll have some time for questions and answers. So for those of you here below, you'll note a Q&A box at the bottom. You're welcome to submit your questions as they arise below, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentations. So with that, just a few housekeeping notes. As you will have noticed, we are so fortunate to have Kevin, who is the English interpreter, doing ASL for this panel and presentation. So this event will be recorded and made available in Gallery 1CO3's YouTube playlist in about 1 week's time. So, and then as I mentioned, the piece about the questions below. So with that, we will get started. So our first presenter will be Elder Marlene Gallagher. Elder Marlene Gallagher is an Anishinaabe Kwe from Sagkeeng First Nation. Marlene attended residential school and has a good understanding of the child welfare system in Manitoba and its long-term impacts on children and families. She speaks Anishinaabe and takes part in various cultural practices and ceremonies. Marlene possesses a Bachelor of Arts honors degree in history from the University of Winnipeg, Bachelor of Education degree with double majors in history and English, and a Master's of Education degree from the University of Manitoba. Marlene has been a regent for the University of Winnipeg Board of Regents and a board member for the St. Norbert Behavioral Health Foundation. Marlene previously worked as an education consultant for the province of Manitoba. In this position, Marlene's portfolio included working closely with schools throughout Manitoba to support Aboriginal education, cultural awareness, and community partnership initiatives. Marlene is currently an independent consultant and a current member of the Speakers Bureau for the Treaty Relations Commissions of Manitoba. So thank you, Marlene, for joining us. And with that, I will pass it off to you.
Bonjour, Anine. I'm just getting my notes ready. Here we are. I too would like to introduce myself in my first language, which is Ojibwe. So, Misquah Makwai Kwe Indigenous, Makwa Dotam, Saging Doinja, Marlene Indigenous, Shakanashi Mwin. So my name is Red Bear Woman, and I'm from the Bear Clan. And I'm from Sagkeeng First Nation, and my English given name is Marlene. So today I'm going to talk about cultural abundance and, of course, learning from the land. Now, for me, those two are very interconnected. So you will see throughout, the things I speak about today, how so many things within our culture is interconnected. And of course, when I talk about learning about culture, there are several, areas that come in to mind. And of course, we have our ceremonies and celebrations. We have our languages, our clan systems, the environment, and of course, our traditional knowledge. And so all of these are part of our interdependence and interconnectedness within our systems. So our Indigenous worldviews, of course, vary among First Nations in Canada. Each area is very unique in their own way. They change over time, and some beliefs might be universal in some ways. And of course, that interconnectedness and interdependence, and of course, that understanding of Mother Earth. And we refer to Turtle Island as Mother Earth, which is North America. And so, of course, the whole concept that all of life is interconnected is a worldview that guides the way in which many Indigenous people see themselves as part of the natural world. Now, this sense of interconnectedness informs the spiritual, the physical, the social, and of course, our social practices, such as our dance, our storytelling, and even our ceremonies. And there's many more to that. And of course, Indigenous people have a vital role within their jurisdictions to share knowledge and stewardship practices in restoring ecosystems across our traditional territories. And a lot of work is being done in those areas. The land provides sustenance to the people, and in return, Indigenous people offer their thanks through our dance and song. And this is a way for us to show respect for the land that sustains us and has helped us, and provided for us for many generations to forever, really. Another commonly shared worldview is that we are the traditional stewards. We maintained complex ecosystems and wildlife that sustained our nations for many generations. It was understood that a damaged relationship would impair our ability to live and fulfill healthy lives. So these are some of the pieces that I refer to as, learning about culture and understanding where it all comes from. Now, all of this is connected into learning from the land, because those connections are physical, spiritual, social, and of course, cultural. Indigenous people have had a strong connection to land, or as I refer to, Mother Earth. We have a responsibility to maintain a balance, which is rooted in respect. We don't live off the land. Indigenous people live in balance with the land, and we continue our lifelong learning from the land throughout our existence here on Earth. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about how that impacts, learning from the land through traditional knowledge. We have many systems within our traditional knowledge. Now, Indigenous traditions and belief systems teach us about respect and a strong sense of place and belonging. This sustains knowledge and ways of life that looks at a natural resource in a sustainable manner, ensuring there is environmental care for the social well-being of future generations. That is part of what was passed on through our ancestors. It is this connection between culture and land that teaches us how our traditional ways are connected, and we respect all things in the environment. Indigenous cultures have lived in balance with the land for centuries, so traditional knowledge and connection is deeply rooted in an original relationship with that land. An Indigenous cultural landscape is a living landscape that Indigenous nations value because of their enduring relationship with that place and its continuing importance in our cultural identity. And when I say that, for me, it's also a place, a location that becomes important and part of my identity. Indigenous traditions and belief systems teach us about respect, a strong sense of place and belonging. Indigenous knowledge is also inherently tied to land, not to the land in general, but to a particular landscape, the landforms, the biomes where ceremonies are properly held. Stories are properly recited, medicine is gathered, and transfers of knowledge properly authenticated. When I talk about that landscape, what comes to mind for me coming from Saugeen is the Canadian Shield. The Canadian Shield has rocks, the outcrops of rocks, rivers, and trees. And for me, that's the landscape that I associate my identity with. And many Indigenous people will feel that way, where they grew up or where they were born, they're connected to the land in that way. And for me, it also meant, the stories going back to spending time with my family and going camping. So, those are stories we carry forward as well through learning from the land, because it teaches us so much. Indigenous worldviews also teach people to live in balance that is grounded in ourselves, to develop relationships with others, and of course, the environment. The most prevalent concept is that the belief that land is alive and the lifeblood to our traditions, an interrelatedness that is most often rooted in a shared relationship, a landscape that is connected to the spirit of the land. And for us as Indigenous people, we say that everything has a spirit. And that is also important to recognize. The land provides sustenance to the people. In return, the people offer thanks. So through our families, our peers, and communities, we come to learn about ourselves through our ecologies, our land, and our environments. Our elders and families share their knowledge of place in their daily personal and communal adventures on the land. In traditional tales, timed with the seasons and in the context of everyday life, we come to know ourselves in place. And by its depth of beauty, abundance, and gifts, we learn to respect and honor that place. All Indigenous peoples have then a land base and ecology from which they have learned. And it is there that they honor the spirit of that land in ceremonies, in traditions, prayers, customs, and beliefs. Indigenous people have had a long relationship with creation, a connection to a physical landscape that surrounds them, such as plants, land, water, sun, moon, and of course, the sky world. So everything to us has this spirit. And of course, Indigenous culture and our connection to the land are essential to sustain our spiritual connections. However, Indigenous people's connection to the culture and land were severed by government policies of assimilation, residential schools, and of course, the child welfare system, essentially ensuring that several generations would have lost their traditional connections. That's why those stories of camping with your family become even more important today. I remember before going to residential school, packing things up and, going blueberry picking, and the whole family would go. And I remember being the youngest, I'd probably spend the first while eating the berries and, just enjoying being out there in nature. And those are some stories that a lot of children that went to residential school didn't even experience. I was fortunate to have experienced some of that in my life because many didn't. And of course, the loss of our language. That is how I learned my language, was spending time on the land with my family and having grandparents and having great grandparents that were able to teach us about the importance of the land as well. So when we are not taught in these traditional ways, learning from these areas of knowledge, we become spiritually, emotionally, socially, physically, and of course, environmentally impoverished. We then perpetuate this imbalance between people and land. We have worked hard for many years now, and we are returning to this knowledge and relearning some of the pieces that were lost. So think of it, when I talk to people, I always say, when we lose an elder, it's like losing a book or a library. So I always like using that analogy. Think of it like a book. The history of the land, the people. For years, you're tearing out pages from that book. You're tearing out our language, our ceremonies, our identities. And those are all getting lost, and then you're tearing out our cultural philosophies that sustain our spiritual connection to the land. How does a cultural group carry on from there? And for many, that would be very difficult. But as Indigenous people, we are very resilient. We've been fortunate that we have elders who, told these stories in secret when our ceremonies and our culture was banned for so many years. And that was all in the name of assimilation, to make sure that, through the residential schools, that we became assimilated to mainstream society. But at the same time, it impoverished our people of the right to a culture that was very rich. So with that, I just want to say miigwech and thank you for listening to me.
Miigwech for that, Marlene. That was such a great way to start off this panel. I just want to thank you for sharing about the cultural abundance of Indigenous people, the interconnectedness about our people, the land, and sharing about really how traditional knowledge is deeply rooted to the land. Again, your stories about how we have been impacted by residential schools and your own experience it just kind of reminded me a little bit too of the many stories I've heard of our people, illegally practicing our culture and ceremonies to keep that alive for us, and keeping watch for the Indian agents, making sure that they don't come. And so
Yes, for sure.
yeah, so I just want to thank you for that, for starting off our panel in such a good way. And so with that, I just we'll move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Kaila Johnston. She is the supervisor of Education, Outreach, and Public Programming at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. In this role, Kaila oversees matters related to the support of educators, development of resources, establishment of outreach initiatives, as well as public engagement on residential schools and their legacy. Prior to joining the NCTR, Kaila worked with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a statement gatherer and coordinator to support statement gathering activities. She holds a BA honors in criminal justice from the University of Winnipeg and a Master of Science in International Crimes and Criminology from Vrije University. I'm sorry if I misread that, from Amsterdam. So with that, thank you, Kaila.
There we go. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm going to try very hard to stay within my allotted time. And in my presentation, I'll be talking about reconciliation, some different perspectives of it, a look at a few residential schools from Treaty 1 territory, and efforts taken to address reconciliation in the region. And with that, I'm going to share my screen and get started. So a little bit more information about myself. I'm an intergenerational residential school survivor. So my mother attended residential school, as did her siblings, parents, and extended family, represented in the collage that you now see on screen, with 3 schools located in the Qu'Appelle Valley in Saskatchewan, which are Maryville, Round Lake, and Qu'Appelle, and then a 4th school, Crowfoot, located in Alberta. So not only have I heard the stories of residential school experiences from my family, but also as a statement gatherer for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. So the photo you see up on screen is of the statement gatherers, archivists, and staff working under the statement gathering unit. Now, I come from the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and here is just a very quick look at our mandate and what we are tasked to do. The settlement agreement mandated that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission create a permanent archive for all the materials gathered. And in 2013, the University of Manitoba was selected as the permanent host of what was then known as the National Research Center. So as the permanent home for all materials, documents, statements, we are here to ensure that survivors and their families have access to their own history, that educators can teach this material in their classrooms, that researchers can dive deeper into the mysteries that exist, and that the public and the history, those are intertwined, that the public can access this historical record and help foster healing and reconciliation, and that the history and legacy are never forgotten or repeated. Now, if we take a look at reconciliation itself, this is a subjective term. It means different things to different people, communities, institutions, organizations. And during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission final report, they defined reconciliation as a process of establishing and maintaining a respectful relationship. Now, a critical part of reconciliation involves repairing damaged trust by doing things like making apologies, providing for individual and collective reparations, and following through with actions that demonstrate real societal change. And when youth from across Canada were asked in 2019, what does reconciliation mean to them? This is the series of answers they provided. And so those with familiarity with the concept identified rebuilding trust and relationships as a main theme. It also included looking at apologies and making amends. And lastly, the 3rd theme was related to repairing and correcting the past. Now, with that, if we take a look at reconciliation through different lenses of relationships, say at the individual, community, and macro or nation level, we can see reconciliation happening at various stages here. At the individual level, it involves families, individuals, and relationships. So it could be an intergenerational survivor reconnecting with culture, with ceremony or language. At the meso or community level, it could be including territorial welcomes or acknowledgements at the start of events or in prominent places. And at that macro level, that nation to nation changes would look like implementing the calls to action or the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, most recently, there has been work around the Canadian Reconciliation Barometer, where a group of researchers and practitioners worked to develop how we might measure reconciliation in Canada. And what they determined is that reconciliation requires a good understanding of the past, acknowledging harm, and having meaningful apologies. It also requires engaging with Indigenous communities in these respectful relationships. They also identified that it was key that equality between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples is established with thriving Indigenous families, youth, culture, and languages. And lastly, they said reconciliation means respect for the natural world around us. Now, what they did add and what I've highlighted on screen is that their definition of reconciliation is ever evolving. And as we learn more about what is reconciliation and what it looks like, that definition may change in the future. With that, going back to the survey I highlighted before, which came from the Environics Institute, partnering with the MasterCard Foundation and the Canadian Roots Exchange. They also asked those youth, what were the biggest or most significant barriers to reconciliation? And youth identified myths and stereotypes about what Indigenous people receive, a lack of political leadership willing to implement change, and the lack of knowledge about Indigenous culture and history as being some of the biggest barriers. Similarly, the Yellowhead Institute has released a number of reports on the progress of what calls to action have been implemented to date, and they identified 5 themes that are barriers to reconciliation, which we also see reflected in that Environics Institute survey. The first is paternalism. So this is an attitude and behavior of politicians, bureaucrats, policymakers stating that they know best compared to Indigenous people who should be taking the lead on issues and providing their own solutions. It's present in anti-Indigenous structural discrimination, where Canada is asserting legalness to justify the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from Indigenous lands and manufacturing poverty. It is the public interest or lack of public interest, with policymakers using the lack of interest of non-Indigenous Canadians to shore up their inaction. It's also present through insufficient resources, so lots of promises, but there's ongoing and rampant funding inequalities, meaning reconciliation is out of reach. And the last one highlighted is that reconciliation has been used through exploitation or performance, where individuals, organizations, institutions have used reconciliation as a means to adjust or ensure that their visible perspective or the opinions about them is managed to save their reputation. Now, in addition to these 5 barriers, the Yellowhead Institute also identified 2 observations, one being not every call to action identified by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission requires lasting or permanent structural changes. And in fact, if you take a look at the calls to action which have been addressed to date, most of those are symbolic-based actions. For instance, instituting a national day for truth and reconciliation, as well as implementing an office for Indigenous languages, as well as, for instance, adjusting the citizenship oath. Now, the second piece they identified is that the calls to action have been used as a tally sheet or list, where the more that we can check off, we can say we've achieved reconciliation. But of course, reconciliation is an ongoing process. It requires a commitment. So even though a call to action may be addressed 1 year, if those government institutions fail to continue to address that call to action, it will become stalled. Now, one piece that I really liked that came out of the 2021 report was this quote here from Dr. Ava Jewell and Dr. Ian Mosby. And something we often hear is, when will this be enough? When can we stop focusing on Indigenous peoples and reconciliation? And to that, they said, it will be enough when the systems of oppression no longer exist. We will arrive at reconciliation when Indigenous peoples can say at the barest minimum that they are experiencing and living the standards that reflect their vision of a healthy and prosperous community. Now, in the last little bit, I wanted to showcase some of the information about the residential school system and reconciliation actions. Up on screen, we have a map of the recognized schools under the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. I'm going to zoom on into Manitoba, and you can see that there are 5 residential schools that fall under Treaty 1 territory: the Brandon School, Sandy Bay, Portage La Prairie, Assiniboia, and Fort Alexander. With that, I'm going to highlight the efforts that have been done at a few of these schools, starting with Brandon. The Brandon Residential School was located 3 miles northwest of the city, and it was operated by the Methodist, United, and Catholic Church at different times throughout the years, closing in 1972. With the years 1967 and 72, it operated as a residence only, with students being bused into the city of Brandon. It was later abandoned and demolished in the year 2000. Over the past little while, there have been teams working on the search of unmarked burials around the Brandon Residential School, with at least 2 known confirmed sites and a 3rd site on property owned by a First Nation. Now, through this work, there have been 104 potential graves identified, or unmarked burials, but we only know for sure about 78 of them, which are accountable through records at our center, whereas Catherine Nichols, the project lead for the Sioux Valley Dakota Nation's Missing Children's Project, has confirmed the names of at least 99 children. Now, challenges have been encountered with the Turtle Crossing Campground RV Park, where there are at least 54 burials along the Assiniboine River. In 2022, after protests were held at the entrance of the park, a tentative agreement was reached between the Sioux Valley Dakota Nation and the owner of that land. Now, despite agreeing to it, the owner says he does not think work is necessary, and he wants to put a fence up around the 56 graves that have been identified, whereas the second cemetery is owned by the Brandon Research Center, and the site of the school is under the care of the nearby Sioux Valley Dakota Nation. Now, just to put into context, here are a few photos of the area. At its peak operation, the Brandon School covered 960 acres. And you see the North Hill Burial Ground was created sometime in the 1920s with about 24 graves, and approximately 24 also being found in 2 unmarked locations around the school. And then, as you can see closer to the river, is the Assiniboia River Burial Ground. And that you see the box there on screen, that is the site that they are looking to put up the fence. I'm also going to talk about the Assiniboia Residential School here in Winnipeg. So this was located at 621 Academy Road and was also operated by the Catholic Church. The Grey Nuns were also involved in the 1960s, and then the federal government after 1969. Now, in 1967 to 73, students were bused to 17 different public schools across Winnipeg. Schools including Daniel McIntyre, J.B. Mitchell, Silver Heights, Grant Park, Isaac Brock, and Calvin High School, just to name a few. Now, there are no cemeteries associated with this specific school. However, there has been work done related to memorialization. Construction began on a memorial this past summer with the survivors of the Assiniboia Residential School Group. On September 30th, the former students and community members attended the unveiling of this commemorative monument. And we had heard from Elder Betty Ross, who said, "We are witnessing the impacts of stories shared by students who attended the schools. Difficult life journeys often led to beautiful destinations, hence this lasting commemorative monument that depicts the legacy of truth, honor, respect, and resilience for years to come." In addition to that, we had the renaming of the park, Wellington Park, to an elder and community member who passed away, Theodore Fontaine. He envisioned this memorial, which would honor survivors while also ensuring the terrible impacts of the school system were not forgotten. Now, when he was 7 years old, Ted Fontaine was forced to attend the Fort Alexander School, and he later attended the Assiniboia School. He passed away in 2021. However, his wife and community have been still working on his behalf. His wife, Morgan Fontaine, said, "This land was special to him. It symbolized a place where he and others could come out and not be supervised and dominated and observed." And the last school I'm going to talk about is Fort Alexander. Now, the Fort Alexander Residential School was located on the Fort Alexander Reserve, now known as Seguin, near Pine Falls, and it was also operated by the Catholic Church from 1904 to 1970. After 1970, it was turned into a day school. Now, the former residential school operated again as a residence only from 1969 to 1970 and offered a primary education in the early years, and it provided up until high school level classes until 1958, when those students then transferred to the Assiniboia School. Now, most recently in the news, a former priest and worker, Arthur Massey, was charged with indecent assault on a girl who attended the school between 68 and 70. This individual worked at 3 residential schools, Pine Creek, Fort Alexander, and Brandon. He pled not guilty and will appear in court this upcoming March 7th and 8th at the Manitoba Court of King's Bench. And this is the only current investigation in progress in Manitoba. Now, this all started with Victoria McIntosh, a survivor and the victim identified. She remembers that Massey was always waiting outside the girls' bathroom, which is one of the areas where students were assaulted. She said, "I remember that smile of his. At first he was nice, he was soft in his mannerism, but at the same time he reminded me of a snake. He would just slither." She also said, "When I got older, I just put it away. I put it away in my mind. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to think a lot about things that I witnessed there because of guilt." Now, before I conclude, I did want to highlight a few other reconciliation pieces. One being that Tim Hortons Orange Sprinkle Donut campaign launched in 2021, which raised $1.6 million for Indigenous charities like the Indian Residential School Survivor Society. Funds raised in 2022 went to New Pathways Foundation, the Orange Shirt Society, the IRSS, and James Smith Cree Nation. Those who assisted in its development said, "When we heard about the amount of money that was raised, it gave us a huge sense of accomplishment. The Orange Sprinkle Donut, I believe, will create a better quality of life for a lot of our families and communities." And if we go back to Winnipeg here on September 30th, there were also 2 other monuments that were erected in Winnipeg, one outside the Mamawi Center and Gathering Place, as well as one in the Assiniboine Park. The sculpture you see was designed by Métis artist Erwin Head, who passed away, and survivors and additional artists stepped in to finish it. And as the coordinator of the event said, its meaning was that it helps acknowledge those tragedies, because that's the first step, acknowledging the truth. Additionally, in Assiniboine Park, the Southern Chiefs organization unveiled the residential school totem pole by artist Charles Joseph. A design of the pole includes a mother holding her 2 children, symbolizing those who never returned home. Now, the piece will eventually be featured prominently in the project around the Hudson's Bay building in downtown Winnipeg, now owned by the Southern Chiefs Foundation. Now, the last piece I wanted to end on was for you to take away some questions and things. First being that the work around missing children and unmarked burials is at the start. We are looking at decades of work ahead, requiring support for ongoing searches. We work with experts who are overwhelmed with the amount of support that needs to be provided to communities. It has taken since 2007 to get to this point, and new generations of experts and researchers are needed. We also have to think about questions related to exhumation or repatriation. Without cemetery maps, exhumation and testing remains is really the only way to determine who might be buried there, and it is up to each and every community to determine what they would like to do next. Efforts so far regarding reconciliation work have been symbolic, have been related to easy and impactful and transformative actions, from erecting memorials, renaming parks and streets, tearing down statues, an apology given by Pope Francis, funding for reconciliation projects, and the prosecution of perpetrators. But there is still much that needs to be done at all levels, from individual, community to nations, to address reconciliation. And we have to think, how and can we and should we measure progress of reconciliation? Now, I'm now out of time, so I'm going to close up my shared screen here and go back to Angeline.
Wow, thank you for that, Kaila. That was a lot. I think I just want to acknowledge all of your hard work that you've done with the survivors, both with the commission and currently at the NCTR. Thanks for providing that update on the calls to action, the barriers to them, and kind of delving into all of that. I love that you also acknowledge that reconciliation continues to require work from all of us. And then also just, I think it was really great that you acknowledged the local residential schools. As I imagine Marlene perhaps maybe went to the Fort Alexander. My dad, my uncle went to the Assiniboia residential school as well. And so, it's still unbelievable to me that most people involved in residential school and in the harms that were caused have not been investigated or charged. So with that, I just, those were some really great takeaways from your presentation. So I hope we can all continue moving forward in a good way towards reconciliation. So again, miigwech for your presentation and for sharing. And with that, we'll move on to our final speaker, Professor Aimée Craft. So Aimée is an award-winning teacher and researcher, recognized internationally as a leader in the areas of Indigenous laws, treaties, and water. She prioritizes Indigenous-led and interdisciplinary research, including through visual arts and film, co-leads a series of major research grants on decolonizing water governance, and works with many Indigenous nations and communities on Indigenous relationships with and responsibilities to Nibe water. She plays an active role in international collaborations relating to transformative memory in colonial contexts and relating to the reclamation of Indigenous birthing practices as expressions of territorial sovereignty. Professor Craft is an associate professor at the Faculty of Common Law, University of Ottawa, and an Indigenous Anishinaabe Métis lawyer from Treaty 1 territory in Manitoba. She is the former director of research at the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and the founding director of research at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. She practiced at the Public Interest Law Center for over a decade, and in 2016, she was voted one of the top 25 most influential lawyers in Canada. In 2021, she was awarded the prestigious Canadian Bar Association's President's Award. And as an author, Breathing Life into the Stone Fort Treaty, her award-winning book, focuses on understanding and interpreting treaties from an Anishinaabe and Naknagawan legal perspective. Treaty Words, her critically acclaimed children's book, explains treaty philosophy and relationships. She is past chair of the Aboriginal Law Section of the Canadian Bar Association and a current member of the Speaker's Bureau of the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. So miigwech, and with that, I will pass it off to Aimée.
Miigwech, Angeline. I'm so pleased to have you introduce me and to guide us through this panel today. I wanted to also say miigwech to Jennifer for the invitation and for Jaimie Isaac and her work and identifying this panel of all Kwe. We're all women sitting here and kind of sharing these different perspectives. And that ties to what I was hoping to speak a little bit about today, or what I was asked to speak about. And I was looking at the description of Brings to Light, and it is such a robust and mixed exhibition that addresses the residential schools, but also these colonial structures that have oppressed and devalued Indigenous knowledge systems. And in large part, that has contributed to the devaluation of Indigenous women and girls. And in your introduction, Angeline, you mentioned that I was Director of Research for the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. And that was the first question that we asked at the inquiry. What is it that has allowed for the devaluation of the lives of Indigenous women and girls? And the short answer to that is colonialism, structures that are rooted in the idea that land is meant to be taken up, that it's meant to be extracted from to bring a profit. And if you think of, Marlene's words right at the beginning, that thinking of the earth as a mother, if the philosophy is to take from that, to extract, to disregard its integrity as a being, Mother Earth, then we can easily see how that translates into colonial thought about how Indigenous women are not valuable either, or women generally, in a lot of sort of capitalistic models. And women's work has been devalued, but women's bodies, women's presence within governance has been largely devalued by these forms of structures. So to have a conversation about matriarchy, Indigenous matriarchy, I think is really appropriate in this context and ties directly to this larger project of assimilation and colonization in Canada. I want to start by acknowledging that Anishinaabe governance and other Indigenous forms of governance are always centered around women and families for the most part, and they're articulated in different ways, but they have at their core and their center the protection of women and children. And we see that reflected in other societies as well, but maybe not from the same ethic or the same perspective, where we think to women maybe as in need of protection, whereas Anishinaabe governance centers women as clan mothers and grandmothers within that system, very powerful decision makers holding authority and jurisdiction within those governance structures. Currently, I hold a research chair in Nibiminoaki Nakunagewan, which is Indigenous governance in relationship with land and water. And just take note of the English translation there, Indigenous governance in relationship with land and water. And it's not a relationship to or about or over something, it's in collaboration, or I would even propose in kinship with, in relationship, filial relationship with lands and waters. And I think if we take that as a starting point, we can understand how Indigenous women were so essential to lawmaking historically, that they're absolutely critical in how we make decisions today, and that treaties themselves were based in this understanding of women as central figures, but that were devalued by the colonial system. So I think there are two things that are operating when treaties are made. And I think that, one of those starting points is actually the understanding of original treaties that were made between Sky Realm and Earth Realm, and how those collaborations take place. We see that reflected a lot in pipe teachings and other parts of ceremony that we continue today, understanding that those relationships, those ways of interaction were actually built as original treaties that we modeled our treaty making on thereafter. And to anyone who would think that treaties began with colonial presence, well, that's inaccurate. There's a lot of treaty making that's taking place on territory before even any colonizer, any fur trader steps foot, any settler is present in the territory. And those are treaties between different nations of being, between Indigenous people and nations of being, deer nations, fish nations, between Indigenous nations themselves within those nations. So Indigenous people are coming to treaty negotiation as very skilled diplomats. And we see that reflected in Treaty 1, which was made in this territory here. And we see with that, that long history of treaty making, affirmations of jurisdiction, of women being present, but that the tone of those negotiations becomes colonially dominated by men, and the commissioners want to speak with the men. But what's interesting is there is an account of the camp just outside Laura Fort Garry, multiple women and families and children that are settled in that area for the purpose of negotiating the treaty in July and August 1871. So women are present, they're part of decision making. We know from the written record that there's this camp and that there are activities and there are discussions that are taking place within whatever structure. I'm going to suppose, I'm not taking this from the written record, I'm going to suppose that clans are having these discussions in the evenings and that they're using the tobacco that's offered to them to be part of those petitions that are made about the important decisions that they were having to make as potential treaty partners. So Indigenous women are involved, but they're kind of displaced by the colonial actors in this sense. So they're involved, but not really documented. They're not directly engaged in the negotiation in terms of how it's reported, but they're there and they're exercising influence. And some of you are probably thinking, yeah, we're always there. We're always exercising influence, and it may not be overt, but there are all of these mechanisms where we take responsibility. And I think that's one important point to note when we start thinking about laws and governance and jurisdiction and authority. That doesn't necessarily mean ruling with a heavy fist. It can mean, like what I said earlier in relation to that research chair, is governance in relationship with. And I think that that's a large part of how Indigenous women's governance has been exercised throughout centuries and millennia. I think what we might note too is that these relationships of treaty are often built on kinship relationships, and Treaty 1 in particular is one of the early treaties that's made on the basis of mother relationship. And what Anishinaabe people understood in the making of that treaty as a good mother relationship, one of care and kindness, compassion, Kijiatsuin, that was all included in how equality would be realized between all of the children of the mother, and that autonomy of the children would be fostered. I equate that with self-determination now, so that the Queen at Treaty 1 time is representing this idea of a mother figure, but not as someone who is dominating over children or deciding for children, but rather helping achieve the self-determination of each of her children, who are, from the Anishinaabe perspective, legal persons. They're whole entities. The child, we know, is born as a full person. They don't have to wait till the age of 18 to have rights. They are our children. We look at them as equal to anywhere else. They are prized little autonomous actors, and we don't control them. Free will is a very important part of understanding what it is to be Anishinaabe. So I think that that's represented in kind of how that relationship was perceived by the Anishinaabe that made Treaty 7 generations ago. And so that's not reflected in the commissioner's thoughts. I don't think it's reflected in Western or settler thought at that time, but that relationship from the Anishinaabe perspective is really based on that kinship with a mother figure that will foster that self-determination and autonomy. And so when we think then about next steps, treaty implementation and treaty interpretation, we have this colonial structure that I was talking about, these extractive imperatives and these extractive relationships over land, about land, inland. And we're thinking of ownership and disregard and devaluation of land by taking it up, making it crown land, exploiting it. And we do the same with Indigenous women and girls in the whole period following kind of treaty making or settler establishment within the territory. So that becomes, I think, a really important tension to note, and one that's similar in purpose and effect as the residential school system and its creation. The goals were to be to be in a state where Indigenous people did not exist as Indigenous people. The same is happening with Indigenous lands. in and around that time and continuing until today. The ultimate consequence, though, is that it was largely unsuccessful as a project. Not to devalue any of the impact that residential schools or the assimilation project or colonial extractivism has had in Canada, but what has survived that is Indigenous women's jurisdiction and authority, which is in large part centered around, I would say, land, water, families, and culture. And those are key markers of nationhood. But having and retaining that jurisdiction over land, water, families, children, and language is significant historically, but also in a contemporary sense. And so today, if we think about, how that is given effect, we have in large part the revitalization of Indigenous laws and legal orders as part of the project of reconciliation, as the TRC recommended. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is that cornerstone which recognizes the significant impacts of colonialism on Indigenous women. And we're starting to see, for example, initiatives in Canada and in federal legislation of priority areas. For example, Indigenous languages legislation federally, child welfare, child protection legislation federally, and UNDRIP legislation. We're seeing things that are connected to Indigenous women's authority or jurisdiction as some of the core areas in which we're making change or revitalizing Indigenous laws, Indigenous language, Indigenous culture. We see it, I think, also in initiatives that are being taken up by Indigenous women in communities. And I'll point to the example of reclamation of Indigenous birthing, which has become very prevalent in the last few years. I've participated in some work around that. And I think that's a very important part of right from the start, right from the moment a child becomes this being or has chosen his or her parents to belong to, that's reclaimed as wholly Indigenous within the nation, in the nation's authority and jurisdiction, and under the women's authority and responsibility as well. I think that's incredibly important. I think it's also tied directly to territorial sovereignty. So when we reclaim birth, we reclaim those birthing practices, we have children that are connected to home territories, then we have that continued territorial authority or sovereignty within our lands and territories. They are occupied by Indigenous peoples. So those are some of the points of connection that I wanted to make, and I see them very much tied to the renewal of Indigenous women's leadership. I watched with great pride yesterday Chief Merrick and Regional Chief Cindy Woodhouse receiving their headdresses. We have a record number of Indigenous female leaders in Canada, and I think that is emblematic of kind of the direction that we're headed in. And it will have a direct resonance on two things: how we make decisions, so the process for making decisions, what we value, and what we have responsibility to look after. What are those things that are in the purview of Indigenous women's jurisdiction? And as I said, it's land, it's water, it's families, it's culture. And so our languages, our babies, our land, our water, that's what we're responsible to. And so taking up that responsibility is really the order of the day. And it's a form of resistance that I think is captured in this idea of bringing something to light. And I wanted to just end in noting that I'm really grateful for all of Jaimie Isaac's work and for putting this together and for facilitating this really important conversation, and look forward to your questions and comments. So, Chimigwech.
Chimigwech for that, Aimée, for your wonderful words. I was just reflecting on some of the things that you were saying, and I thought what an incredible part of the conversation to share that They share about the importance of treaty making and how that was here before settlers arrived. Thinking about kind of Treaty 1 and how, like, for instance, say at the University of Winnipeg, we just permanently installed the Treaty 1 flags. And on that day, we had my uncle, Charlie Nelson, he was here, who gave an opening prayer, Charlie Nelson Devon, and he was sharing about the importance of treaties and the oral history that's involved, how stories are passed from generation to generation. And so I just want to say thank you for your work on that and for continually sharing about the treaty making process from an Indigenous perspective, from an Anishinaabe perspective. And then, of course, just reflecting on the other piece, the importance of Anishinaabe as central figures historically, the impacts of colonialism on Indigenous women, but then circling back to the importance of the resurgence of traditional practices. I think that is, I agree with you. I love to see women taking up space and women being acknowledged for their leadership. So make much for all that you've shared. And so with that, I just want to thank everybody for their brilliant and insightful presentations for today's talk. With that, we can move to the question and answers. I know a few of them have come in. I guess I'll just start with the first one, though. The first one is directed towards Marlene. It's actually a comment, not a question. But she was just reflecting about how beautifully Marlene described everything. Being from a country which was colonized by a Western dominant culture, this person really appreciated the analogy of the book, which so easily describes the idea of culture being lost and making sure that the culture is not lost, and the importance of further passing down one's own identity and culture. So just wanted to share that with you, Marlene. Yes, and then so there was lots of questions about whether or not this talk would be recorded. Yes, it will be. Part of my housekeeping notes were just that I believe it'll be posted on Gallery 1CO3's YouTube playlist in about a week's time, so it'll be posted there. But the first question I'll go to, though, and I guess whoever wants to jump in, feel free. How can an immigrant in Canada be involved in these movements? For instance, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls reconciliation, amongst others, as it relates to Indigenous people.
I was going to say, I'll jump in right at the end, as I have some slides that I'm going to share, just some quick resources. But Aimée, I saw you on mute as well, so I'll let you go first.
Thanks, Kaila. I think the first thing is acknowledging the communities that the Indigenous communities that are responsible for the territories and the people of where you are. So there's no one across the board answer. It really is about connecting with community and building relationships based on the priority of those communities. So being involved means making relationships. It means doing things that may be difficult. It may mean for someone, being outside at -30 and walking the streets and helping people ensure safety, but always, having that be kind of guided and led by the Indigenous communities where you are finding yourself. And I think a great starting point is just start finding out who those communities are and connecting and offering that help with sincere desire to have an open offer to help.
And I'll go back to sharing my screen, as there are a few things I just wanted to add here. As one of the first things to check out is materials related to the TRC's calls to action, the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report, their 231 calls for justice. If you're looking for what has been done to date, I've just put up on screen several websites that I use to stay up to date. I do recommend the Indigenous Watchdog website. I find it's one of the ones that is most frequently updated, but you can also use CBC Beyond 94, the Government of Canada's website. In addition to that, for kind of looking what to do, kind of a starting place, there are a number of days of action, days of remembrance throughout the entire year. Oftentimes folks are focusing on June or September, but there are a great many days where you can get engaged on, say, honoring elders, supporting murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls activities, Bear Witness Day regarding Jordan's Principle, into the summer months, everything from recognizing the Truth Commission's release of the calls to action or the MMIWG report to the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. There's a variety of ways to get involved, in addition to doing your reading, getting a sense of community, as Aimée already have shared. But there's also some really great resources that were highlighted in the report around allyship. Here are just 4 of them that I often recommend, from Amnesty International, 10 Ways to be a Genuine Ally, to Dr. Lynn Gahill's Ally Bill of Responsibilities. There's quite a lot of content out there to give you the guidance needed when it comes to where can I start or how can I start, and really starting small and then kind of building up in those areas of passion. That's what we often recommend with the calls to action. There are 22 themes. Find that theme that jumps out to you. Also looking at the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Again, finding that section, finding that theme that speaks to you on where you can put your passions and efforts.
Great. I don't know if Elder Marlene wanted to add anything.
I agree with what the other panelists have said too, and the allyship I think is really important. And I work with a lot of schools, and you see a lot of work happening there, even the post-secondary institutions. And I think a lot of people don't understand how deep the missing and murdered Indigenous women situation is, and how it has impacted, so many of us in our communities. And myself, I've lost a cousin and a niece here in Winnipeg that were murdered. But through the Treaty Commission, I've actually talked to the Winnipeg Police, to their new recruits. And I think that was an important and impactful, time that I spent there talking to them, because for a lot of them, I don't think I think they were kind of missed, where they didn't really learn it in school, but yet they were just kind of at the beginning of it, maybe when they finished school. So for a lot of them, a lot of the stuff I shared was so new to them. But I think we need to reach out, and all organizations, to get involved if we really want to, address this, because it is it's a big issue, not just here in Winnipeg or Manitoba, but it's across Canada, even in the United States. So I think, we need that acknowledgement, and I'm glad Kaila was able to share, some of those points, because they're all very important for people, and it's good to hear people saying they want to be committed. But like Aimée said, you really have to, don't just do it because, oh, well, it's going to look good in a photo op or something. Do it because it comes from the heart. Do it because you're going to make a difference, and it's going to matter. So, miigwech, everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. I would totally agree with you all. Allyship are important. Education is definitely important. I know there's some criticisms of, the Indigenous course requirement at the U of W, but I think it goes a long way, because education is so important to addressing some of these, I guess, some of the misinformation maybe that goes on to, and just to being compassionate. And then again, the authenticity, very important. So I feel like maybe people have kind of answered this already, but I still think it's a good question. So someone said, it was mentioned earlier in the presentation that reconciliation may be defined differently by different people. So how do the speakers define reconciliation? And so I know, Kaila, you went through this really thoroughly, but I really loved your quote, but I just wondered if any of the speakers might want to, I don't know, share a little bit for that question.
Well, I think for myself, as a survivor of a residential school and, the impacts on my family, I think what reconciliation is going to mean for me will be completely different, even for my children and grandchildren. So I think it really is dependent on your lived experience part of it. And is it a, personal reconciliation, or is it a, like a community reconciliation? There's so many different ways, like a social reconciliation. So it's really dependent, I think, on us as individuals, how we interpret that. And for me, what I've noticed in the last several years is that the word reconciliation has kind of become this catchy word. Everybody uses it, but what does it really mean for those individuals? And I think you have to start with yourself before you can go on and work in other areas of that. So that's my take on it.
Absolutely.
One thing I'll add, although I shared a bit, I really like this piece about commitment. Oftentimes, again, there's this thought that once we do all the calls to action, we've crossed the finish line, we've achieved reconciliation in Canada, yay, go us. But if we take a look, for instance, at, say, reconciliation barometers across the globe, for instance, in in Rwanda, they have a reconciliation barometer that says they're 95%, 98% reconciled. However, how are they actually measuring reconciliation? Because if you speak to community members, they'll tell you their perspective, their experiences does not match what is being reported in that report. And if we take a look at the United States context, for instance, I know that there is a trend right now to say truth and justice rather than truth and reconciliation, with the idea being, how can we reconcile when there was no good relationship to begin with? And so for them, it was about the truths and finding justice when it came to what had occurred through, in that case, their boarding school system there.
I really appreciate Elder Marlene and Kaila's comments, and I would just say, coming at it from a legal perspective, I've written a couple pieces kind of rejecting old versions of what people called reconciliation, and especially the Supreme Court that said it was reconciling the pre-existence of Indigenous people with like Canadian sovereignty. And I was like, whoa, you can't use reconciliation like that. That doesn't work. But I do very much appreciate how much thought and energy went into trying to define reconciliation from the TRC's perspective. And they actually had a group of elders come together and talk about reconciliation. And what they said is there isn't one word or concept in our languages and our cultures that captures reconciliation. It means a lot of different things in different contexts. And so, I see it like Kaila as a process and a goal, that it's different for everyone. Like you, Marlene, we have to think about it in these different ways. So for me, that idea of establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationships is a core part of the definition of TRC. But I kind of try and reflect it in my actions in my everyday relationships, and kind of try and judge myself by that criteria or standard. And it's been really interesting to catch myself or find myself not acting in a way that promotes reconciliation, not necessarily having those respectful relationships and thinking about how to maintain them. And so that's always my check, and kind of thinking of the teachings that, that I've been given and how to apply those in a reconciliation context, because to me, we have to start with ourselves and how we carry ourselves in the world before we can ask anyone else to be part of a reconciliation. And so, yeah, that's kind of where I try and work on that. And I'm an imperfect being, so it's always, trying to check in and make sure that I'm doing the best that I can on that front.
Incredible. Yeah, no, that's really great. So I was just realizing that Kaila had answered one of the questions that was also asked. So one of the questions was, why was the church used for the residential school system? And so Kaila provided a written answer to that question that I thought was really great. And if I could just read that part out, and then if anybody wants to add, you're more than welcome to. But Kaila's response was, Nicholas Flood Davin, I'm not sure, was tasked by Prime Minister John A. Macdonald to review the boarding school system in the USA in 1879, he returned with the recommendation that the federal government to engage in a partnership with the churches based on two reasons. One, moral. It would be immoral of the government to take children away from community, family, and culture if they didn't replace what was lost with something better, Christianity. Two, economic. The priests and nuns who are already doing this work through missions had taken vows of poverty, so they wouldn't mind getting paid less than teachers in the public school system.
And that is the shortest answer. I could go on long as to the full history of boarding schools prior to the residential school system. But knowing to keep it short, that's one answer.
Yeah, for sure. That's a pretty loaded question. I'm not sure if there was anybody else that wanted to add anything to that, or, I mean, Kaila has some good background on it. But most of this, I'm just cognizant of the time as well. So lots of these are comments and thanks to the speakers. Many thanks to the speakers, a wonderful panel discussion. Thank you to all of the amazing women. These conversations are so important to have, and you were all so well spoken, miigwech. And then I think this next question here. Oh, Madison, are there any books, resources that we could be pointed towards to learn more about the residential school system? I think there was a couple that were mentioned, Aimée, even in your introduction.
Yeah, I think looking at the TRC report, there's a knock on the door. There's a variety of children's books too. There's a ton. And Caleb, you probably have a list somewhere on the NCTR website of amazing resources that could help.
Yes, on our database, we have the teacher resource database, which has now over 500 resources, about 130 French and 400 and some English, which we link out to. It's organized by grade, so early years, middle years, senior years, adult education materials, but there's even more content that's out there. Oftentimes we get asked for book recommendations. I find Google and search engines are your friend. If you type in Indigenous literature 2022, 2021, CBC and a number of other organizations have created very extensive book lists, again, on a variety of topics from residential schools to other colonial systems. So I recommend that, but otherwise, you can always reach out to our center. I do have a 50-page slide deck of a variety of things, some of which were those days of action and remembrance to other resources, podcasts, shows, training opportunities, and the like.
Wow, plenty of resources for sure out there. So yeah, NCTR definitely the place to go. So I guess maybe I'll just do one last question. This next one, has there been any talk of having traditional Indigenous languages and culture taught in the Canadian school system in a more intentional, Indigenous informed way, perhaps likened to something in New Zealand?
I think, Angeline, you should probably answer this one.
Okay, sure. I mean, I'm not a panelist, but I mean, just from personal experience and kind of the work that I do in the inner city, it's really incredible to see a school like Isaac Brock exist, where they have lots of Cree and Ojibwe language speakers who are teaching immersion to kids. I think it's in grades 1 to 6 now, which is really incredible, or K to 6, I should say. It's pretty incredible. I know my nephew has been in there since the start of it, and now he's in grade 6. So it's really beautiful to see young children being immersed in the language and being immersed in the culture, learning about the culture. And then I guess through the center, we also do various programs just to kind of provide the opportunity for people who haven't always been connected to Indigenous language and culture, that opportunity to reconnect, because colonization was had a huge impact on our people. And I recognize, especially in the inner city, I noticed this a lot, that people aren't always connected and are looking for ways to connect. So we do lots of different programs at the center, whether it's beginner Anishinaabemowin, intermediate, something like a powwow club. It's always a really great starting point. You know, we have huge numbers of people showing up. So yeah, I guess, and I'm sure there's many other schools that I haven't mentioned. I think there's a Seven Oaks school that's doing language immersion. And then in communities like Manitoba First Nation Education Resource Center, through MFN and MFNSS. I think I have that right. Maybe you would know more about that, Marlene. But I know lots of the schools are doing lots of language and cultural work too now. So it's really incredible to see.
Yes, it is. There are a lot of school divisions that are doing this. I know up in Thompson, like the Cree immersion is great. That was one of the schools I worked with, and even you know, other schools I went to, you walk into the kindergarten class and the kids were completely immersed. And you know what? It was so nice to hear. There was those little voices, and it just made me think like, wow. And to think, you know, they wouldn't let us do that when we were kids, but now here's these little kids walking around immersed in their language, their culture, and they're so happy. And that's the way all children should be. And you know what, that was just wonderful for me to see. And I continue to promote the language and culture, like with my kids. And you know, I'm teaching my grandsons, they're becoming little drummers already. And to me, that's also part of my reconciliation is, you know, to teach about our culture and the language, and for people to learn, you know, through education, the history of our people. And I think moving forward, education is going to be, you know, one of the big key areas to, you know, move forward in a good way with all of Canadians. So, yeah, miigwech.
Totally agree. So with that, I guess it is 3:53. I just want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank the panelists again one more time. Thank Jennifer from Gallery 1C03. As I mentioned before, this talk will be posted on their YouTube page. And then I also want to thank the NCTR and the Treaty Relation Commission of Manitoba for hosting this event. Again, miigwech all of you for coming and listening and for taking a bit of this away.
Miigwech, everyone.